They built 120 homes on my land, but forgot to check who really owned it, and the deadly secret buried beneath. My grandfather always told me that land was the one thing they weren't making more of. "Hold on to it, Michael," he'd say. "No matter what they offer you, the land will outlast the money." Those words echoed in my mind as I sat at his old oak table, sorting through the paperwork he'd left behind. It had been 3 months since Grandpa John passed away, leaving me with nearly 200 acres of seemingly worthless land on the outskirts of Pinecrest County. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The property taxes were modest, but still a burden on my teacher's salary. Every developer in the county had already called, offering what seemed like generous amounts to take this burden off my hands, but I remembered the summers here, the fishing trips, the way Grandpa taught me to track deer and identify edible plants. This wasn't just land. It was my heritage. So when Sarah Jenkins from Westridge Development sat across from me at my kitchen table, her sleek business attire contrasting sharply with my modest home, I already knew my answer before she spoke. "I understand your sentimental attachment, Mr. Harmon, but Westridge Developments is prepared to offer you $2 million for the entire parcel. That's well above market value," she said, sliding a folder toward me with a practiced smile. I smiled politely in return. "I appreciate the offer, Ms. Jenkins, but as I've told the other 5 developers who've contacted me, the land isn't for sale." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to one of practiced concern. "The county is expanding rapidly. This holdout position isn't practical. You're essentially sitting on undeveloped land that could house hundreds of families." My grandfather survived the Depression by living off this undeveloped land. It fed our family for generations. I'm not interested in seeing it covered in vinyl siding and concrete. I handed her folder back, untouched. Sarah sighed, collecting her documents. "Here's my card. When the property taxes become too burdensome, give me a call. Our offer won't stay this generous forever." I might have gone on indefinitely, ignoring development offers and enjoying my occasional weekends at the cabin. But then I noticed something strange during my spring visit, while walking the property line with a surveyor I'd hired to confirm the boundaries. I spotted fresh stakes driven into the ground, marking out what looked suspiciously like building plots. "These weren't here 3 months ago," I said, pointing to the survey markers. "Who put these on my property?" The surveyor checked his GPS device, frowning. "According to your deed and the county records, this is your land, all right, but someone's been marking it up as if they're planning to build." Nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I followed these markers to the northeast corner of my property. As I drove up a newly graded road that hadn't existed on my last visit, my stomach dropped. Construction equipment dotted the landscape. Foundations were being poured. The frames of houses were already going up. They were building on my land, without permission, without purchase, without so much as a courtesy call. I parked my truck and approached a man in a hard hat studying blueprints on the hood of his truck. "Excuse me," I called out, struggling to keep my voice level. "Who authorized this construction?" The construction manager barely looked up from his papers. "Westridge Valley HOA Development. 120 custom homes, community center, and a private park. Who's asking?" "The owner of this land," I replied. That got his attention. He finally looked up, confusion crossing his face. "That's impossible. This land was purchased by Westridge Development 6 months ago. I've seen the paperwork myself." The county records office was quiet that Monday morning as the clerk helped me search through the property transfers. My hands were shaking slightly as she pulled up the relevant documents on her computer. "Here it is," she said, pointing to the screen. "Sale of land from John Harmon Estate to Westridge Developments, recorded 8 months ago. Signed by the executor, a Thomas Harmon." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Thomas Harmon? My father's been dead for 15 years, and my grandfather's will named me as executor, not anyone named Thomas. The clerk's expression shifted from professional detachment to concern. Sir, if what you're saying is true, this is forgery and fraud. By that afternoon, I was sitting in the law office of Eleanor Walsh, an attorney my cousin had recommended as a specialist in property disputes. At 60-something, with silver hair and piercing eyes behind simple glasses, she had the air of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. They fabricated a deed transfer and forged an executor's signature, she said after reviewing my documents. Classic land grab, but unusually brazen. They're betting you won't have the resources to fight them. But I have the original deed. I protested. I have my grandfather's will naming me executor. How could they possibly get away with this? Eleanor removed her glasses, fixing me with a direct stare. Because they assumed you'd settle once construction began. No judge wants to order the demolition of homes that families have already purchased and moved into. They're creating a situation where the damage is already done. I felt the anger building inside me. So they just steal my land and get away with it? A small smile played at the corner of Eleanor's mouth. I didn't say that. You came to me because your cousin mentioned I specialize in property disputes. What your cousin might not have mentioned is that I particularly enjoy cases where powerful entities try to steamroll individuals. Meanwhile, across town in the luxurious offices of Westridge Developments, Sarah Jenkins was meeting with company founder Robert Westridge, a silver-haired man in his 60s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. A cease and desist letter? Robert scoffed, tossing the document onto his desk. Ignore it. By the time this gets to court, we'll have families moved in. No judge will rule against us. Robert, Sarah said cautiously. If he has proof that we falsified documents, Robert waved his hand dismissively. Then we settle for pennies on the dollar compared to what this development is worth. It's simple math, Sarah. We're $70 million in at this point. Even if we have to pay him triple what we offered originally, we're still massively profitable. As weeks passed, I watched my grandfather's pristine forest transform into a suburban development. Trees I'd climbed as a child were bulldozed for swimming pools. The stream where I'd caught my first fish was being rerouted for drainage. Each visit felt like witnessing a slow-motion theft, not just of property, but of memories. They're ignoring the cease and desist, I told Eleanor as I paced her office. 30 homes are almost completed. Eleanor didn't look up from her computer. I expected as much. That's why we filed with the court last week for an emergency injunction, which they'll fight. And by the time it's resolved, Michael, sit down, she interrupted, finally looking up. There's something you need to understand about your grandfather's land. She turned her monitor toward me, showing a geological survey, map with colored overlays. When I started researching your case, I found this survey commissioned by the state 20 years ago. Your grandfather's property sits on one of the largest underground aquifers in the state. Did you know that? I shook my head. He mentioned something about good well water, but nothing significant. Eleanor smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. It's not just significant, it's crucial. This aquifer supplies drinking water to 3 counties, and there are very specific environmental regulations about development over such water sources. The pieces started falling into place. And Westridge didn't do the proper environmental impact studies? They couldn't have, Eleanor replied, because the proper studies would have shown that their current construction plan would contaminate the aquifer. High-density residential development over this type of geology requires specialized waste management systems they haven't installed. Yas leaned forward, hope rising for the first time in weeks. So now what? Eleanor's smile widened. Now we spring the trap. The courthouse was imposing, all marble columns and echoing hallways. I felt small sitting beside Eleanor at our table, facing. The battalion of corporate lawyers Westridge had assembled. Sarah Jenkins sat among them, occasionally glancing my way with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Robert Westridge, however, never looked in my direction, his attention fixed on his legal team as they whispered strategy. Judge Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewed the documents before addressing the court. "I've reviewed the emergency injunction request. Westridge Developments, you claim to have rightfully purchased this land?" The lead corporate lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, stood confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. We have deed transfer documents on file with the county." Eleanor rose calmly. "Fraudulent documents, Your Honor. My client is the rightful executor of his grandfather's estate, and he never sold this property. We have the original deed and will to prove it." The corporate lawyer remained unruffled. "Your Honor, while ownership may be disputed, we ask the court to consider the practical reality. Construction is well underway. Families have already purchased homes. The economic damage of halting construction would be enormous." Judge Martinez looked thoughtful. "Counselor," she addressed Eleanor, "I'm inclined to agree that we have a complex situation. Perhaps your client would consider a generous settlement rather than insisting on an immediate work stoppage." This was exactly what Westridge wanted, to make the situation so complicated that a settlement became the only reasonable option. I felt my heart sink, but Eleanor seemed completely unfazed. "Your Honor, before we discuss settlements, I'd like to introduce Exhibit C," Eleanor said, handing documents to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and opposing counsel. "This is an environmental impact report conducted last week by the State Water Resource Board." I watched as the blood drained from the faces of Westridge's legal team as they scanned the documents. "This development sits directly above the Pinecrest regional aquifer, which supplies drinking water to over 200,000 residents," Eleanor continued. "The construction methods being used by Westridge violate no fewer than 16 state environmental regulations and put the water supply at risk of contamination." The lead corporate lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, we were not aware of any aquifer issues. We conducted standard environmental surveys." "Standard isn't sufficient when dealing with a protected water resource," Eleanor interrupted. "And, interestingly, the aquifer was clearly marked on county geological surveys dating back decades, surveys that any responsible developer would have consulted." Judge Martinez's expression hardened. "Counselor, is your client suggesting that Westridge deliberately ignored environmental regulations?" "We're not suggesting anything, Your Honor," Eleanor replied smoothly. "We're simply pointing out that either Westridge was catastrophically negligent in their due diligence, or they were aware of the aquifer and chose to proceed with inappropriate construction anyway. Neither scenario reflects well on them. Furthermore, Your Honor," she continued, "we've filed a separate motion with the Environmental Protection Division. They've already issued preliminary findings recommending not only an immediate halt to construction, but potential remediation of the already built structures." The judge studied the documents carefully before looking up. "In light of these environmental concerns, I'm granting the emergency injunction. All construction is to cease immediately pending further investigation of both the ownership dispute and these serious environmental allegations." As we exited the courtroom, Robert Westridge intercepted us in the hallway, his face flushed with barely controlled fury. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Name your price." Eleanor stepped slightly forward. "My client isn't interested in selling." Robert scoffed. "Everyone has a price. 10 million? 15? I faced him directly, finding strength in finally confronting the man who thought he could simply take what belonged to my family. My grandfather believed that land wasn't just a commodity to be bought and sold. It was a responsibility. You tried to steal that responsibility from me. "Don't play high and mighty with me," Robert sneered. "You're just driving up the price." "No," I replied calmly. I'm informing you of the terms. You will remove every structure you've illegally built on my property. You will restore the land to its natural state according to environmental remediation standards, and you will publicly admit that you attempted to steal my property through fraudulent documents." Robert laughed incredulously. "That would bankrupt us. No deal. We'll fight." "This for years." Eleanor stepped in, her voice calm but steel-edged. "You could. But the EPA doesn't wait for civil cases to resolve before issuing fines. Those run about $75,000 per day of violation. You've been in violation for approximately 5 months now." I watched as Robert's face paled, his mind clearly calculating the astronomical sum. "And that's before we discuss criminal charges for document fraud," Eleanor added, "and potential class action suits from the families who purchased homes you had no right to build." Robert's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, and the developer's expression shifted from anger to a grim resignation. "We'll need to discuss this with our board," he muttered before stalking away. Eleanor turned to me with a small smile. "And that, Michael, is how you turn a thief's trap back on them." 6 months later, I sat in my living room watching the local news with a cup of coffee, still sometimes disbelieving how everything had unfolded. In local news, the anchor announced, "Westridge Developments has filed for bankruptcy following the settlement of a massive fraud case. The development company was found to have falsified property documents and violated numerous environmental regulations in their attempted construction of the Westridge Valley subdivision." The scene cut to footage of demolition crews carefully dismantling partially built homes on what was once again recognized as my property. The reporter continued, "The company's founder, Robert Westridge, faces criminal charges for document fraud, while former Vice President Sarah Jenkins has turned state's evidence, providing prosecutors with documentation proving the company knowingly violated environmental protections." I muted the television as Eleanor's car pulled up outside. We walked together along the edge of my property, watching as the careful work of remediation continued. "I never wanted this," I admitted, gesturing to where a family had already moved, in before being forced to relocate. "All those families who thought they were buying homes," Eleanor nodded understandingly. "The settlement provided full refunds plus damages to all the buyers, and Westridge's insurance is covering most of it." "And Robert Westridge?" I asked. "Facing criminal charges for the document fraud. His reputation is ruined." Eleanor paused. "Sarah Jenkins turned state's evidence. Apparently she had documentation proving Robert knew about the aquifer all along. She'll likely avoid jail time in exchange for her testimony." We walked through a section where remediation had already begun, with native plants being restored and the natural contours of the land being reinstated. I could have taken the money. $15 million would have changed my life. But standing here, watching the land begin to heal, I knew I'd made the right choice. A week later, I met with an environmental scientist near the stream that had nearly been destroyed for drainage purposes. "The aquifer is already showing signs of recovery," she told me, studying readings from monitoring equipment. "Your decision to place the entire property into a conservation trust was the best possible outcome." "My grandfather would have wanted it this way," I replied, looking out, over the land that had been in our family for generations. In the end, I got something better than money. The Michael Harmon Nature Preserve now serves as an educational resource for the county. 3 times a week, I take students on tours of the same trails my grandfather showed me. I resigned from my teaching position to become the preserve's full-time director, finding more fulfillment in this work than I ever had in the classroom. "And this is yarrow," I explained to a group of 4th graders clustered around me on the trail. "Native Americans used it for medicine. My grandfather showed me how to identify it by these feathery leaves. The preserve remains beautiful and untouched, with the small educational center being the only structure on the entire property." They thought they could steal my inheritance through paperwork and bulldozers. They never realized that my grandfather had taught me that patience and principle are weapons too. Sometimes, the best trap isn't sprung with anger, but with justice. As I sit on the porch of my grandfather's cabin each evening, watching the sunset over the preserved land, I can almost hear his voice on the breeze. The land remains, just as it has for generations, and now it always will.